Okay, so I think we can start. So basically, we are now doing a new study group of LexDAO. This is about the Q blockchain, but also about governance. The Q blockchain has introduced in the crypto space some new ideas, tools, instruments, concept for governance. So we will be discussing not only the Q blockchain, but especially governance. So I will start with Nemo, who is this nice guy with the white shirt. And Nemo is the core contributor of the Q blockchain, and he's leading the business development at the Q development AG, which is the Q blockchain arm. So the question for Nemo is if you could give us just an overall overview of the Q blockchain, just really an introduction. So what is the Q blockchain and the opportunities for governance for DAOs? Thank you.
Of course. So first of all, thank you for the introduction, Paolo. So Q blockchain is first and foremost a decentralized governance framework, right? One of the main issues we kind of see in this ecosystem is once projects want to decentralize their governance or democratize it to give the participants or the community the ability to vote, they open up themselves to different attack vectors, right? And kind of the core of the project itself on its own governance. And that's either by individuals within the community that with time their motivation goes astray, or just being open to 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 have externals buy into the community, take a big chunk of it, and then do with the project what they want, right? And this we saw happen again and again in the Web3 space. Q governance framework is there to kind of help prevent that, and it does that essentially with 3 layers. So the first element, any project that uses the governance framework would have to create a constitution, and that's a legally binding document, right? It's a legally binding contract, not a smart contract per se, but a legal contract, which the LexDAO community understands that quite well. Sometimes in the Web3 space, that's something that we need to go a bit deeper into what that actually means. The problem with these legally binding contracts is they basically have no impact on the blockchain itself, and that's the unique part of Q. That's the second layer of the Q framework, and that's what we call root nodes. These are known entities. They're KYC. They have a reputation in the real world, and they essentially enforce these contracts on chain in different methods. And I think we're gonna go in later into what in a bit more details about these root nodes. So I won't spoil it all now. But then I think that's really the unique part of Q, and the force behind the Q mechanism is these root nodes. The last layer, or the third layer in the Q framework, is the connection to a real world court system or arbitration system. Essentially, Q is an official partner of the International Chambers of Commerce, and they're the last step. And if you need to escalate any dispute, you can escalate all the way to the ICC throughout the different mechanisms within Q. So very simply put, this framework that kind of is a small summary about the Q governance framework.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I will now give the floor to Martin. Martin is a co-founder and board member of Q. So I would ask you, Martin, can you explain, please, more in detail the system of the Q proposals and the system of the root nodes, and how these impact, from your point of view, of course, or from the point of view of Q, on the traditional governance systems currently that we can find in the crypto space for DAOs. Thank you.
Yeah. So taking the points one by one. So first, the proposal part. I think what's important is that any integration into the Q governance framework is always an opt-in integration. So it's also not all or nothing, but projects can, or should really think about first and foremost what elements of their governance they require to be secure. So we always say, there are elements of the governance that are not security critical, but some are. So, for example, treasury decisions might be critical, system upgrades, and so on. But others, how do you manage the community internally that might not need additional security? And for those elements where additional security might be beneficial, that's where they can opt in. Opting in means that you draft a proposal. You submit that on chain, like a normal DAO proposal in many other DAOs or Web3 projects, and that is then voted upon by the Q token holders because they essentially have to support it. They ultimately also carry some risk when they do support other projects, and once that is approved and veto periods have passed and so on, then this governance opt-in, as we say, is effective. On the root nodes, as Nemo said, those are a critical part of the whole Q framework or system, and of course Lex Clinic is one of the root nodes. So some of you or some of the LexDAO members might already be familiar with it. So the idea is that you have these set of entities or people that do run full nodes on the system and are able to interpret rules of the governance framework. So both within the Q constitution itself, which governs the Q core protocol, but also in relation to other projects, other DAOs, other protocols that have submitted those opt-in proposals and are subject to oversight by those root nodes. So it's always based, the decision-making process there is always based on the respective DAO constitutions. So it's not arbitrary, it's not fully discretionary in the sense that you don't know what the outcome is, but essentially you have rules that the DAO has accepted that are supported by Q. And if there are certain decisions then come into play, then the root nodes get active. And the way it's currently structured is that root nodes can have veto rights in certain instances. So, for example, you would have a contract upgrade of your DAO that would be subject to decisions as defined in the DAO constitution, and whether or not those decisions have been met would then be evaluated by the root nodes, and if not, there would be a veto that again could be contested and then taken to the arbitration procedure within the protocol. Having said that, right now the status of the protocol or of the integrations that exist, I would say it's still very much in the beginning. So there are certain standard features that exist that have been developed. We haven't yet seen many bespoke integrations, so which is also one thing that that any protocol can do. But currently, it's mostly what we call standard opt-in features on certain elements, and that's quite a recent development. So the protocol itself has been in production for a while, but actually the onboarding of DAOs that build on Q or build with Q, that's been happening. I think in the last year or so, mainly actually in the last 6 months, 7 months.
Well, thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, just one element of the root nodes, I think, is how do you become a root node, and what does the root node panel look like? Just to give you some idea, currently there are 27 root nodes. Those is a fairly diverse bunch of people and institutions. So, you know, as I said, LexClinic is one of them, but it's quite diverse, and that is by design. So there are lawyers, there are academics, there are crypto VCs, there are infrastructure providers, validators. And the idea being that you should have a diverse panel for various reasons. One is that you do want different competences within the root node panel, but also you don't want one group or subgroup to be dominant in the panel so that it becomes less easily corruptible. So currently, I think out of the 27 root nodes, they reside in 14 jurisdictions. So it's geographically or jurisdictionally diverse, but also, as I said, in terms of you know, skill sets and backgrounds of the people or companies, DAOs that are in this panel.
Okay, so finished? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So now I will pass the floor to Nick. So Nick, please, Nick is a LexDAO operator, so as also a crypto lawyer. So as a crypto lawyer, LexDAO operator, so someone who has been managing a DAO for a while, I will say now. Can you give us your opinion about governance in DAO and the Q blockchain, as just explained, described by Nimo and by Martin? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And Martin, nice to see you. It's been a while. And thank you for having me, and thank you for joining us. Yeah, I mean, LexDAO is a legal engineering guild, so there's obviously a lot of tie-in to governance. I think we have a unique perspective, partially because of our history, partially because of our membership, and partially because we're, you know, running the experiment ourselves. We run our own governance, and we're constantly updating our own governance based on what we need. But being just an industry association as we are, we kind of have some things that are more narrowly focused on what our needs are, and some things that are true to everyone, you know, including finance, tax, and normal voting. But we also get in from our membership the fact that many of the lawyer members have clients, and so they bring a lot of other needs in that we kind of end up facing and discussing within the DAO. So we're kind of focused on ourselves for how we can constantly improve our own governance. We're focused on the clients of our members, the problems that they bring, the novel problems of crypto. And we're also all broadly interested in the ecosystem, and that's kind of how we all ended up where we are and in the place we are. And as Martin said, LexClinic has been a root node operator for Q now, I guess, going on a couple years. At least that's when I last recall the first conversations of the root node. I haven't been that personally involved in it, but was constantly coming in and out of the DAO as those questions of what could we provide, what's our role, and is this something that is worth, you know, being involved in. LexDAO attempts to be very chain and protocol agnostic, but we don't really let that stop us from trying to build with people and trying to move forward. And I think Q has provided a really interesting theoretical construct and is putting it into practice in a way that really makes it address some of the harder issues of having multi-party governance, having governance engage with jurisdictions, not engage with jurisdictions. And I think, you know, in my opinion, it comes from a perspective of very strong kind of hard-coded, hard law, allowing governance to control itself internally with as minimum external intrusion, but also doing as much as it can to protect from many of the known attack vectors and setting up a structure that's somewhat predictable in that realm so that users can come in, understand it reasonably, see that it's transparent, see who the node operators are, see what the process is, and then you know, assume a lower risk profile than certainly in a lot of other areas of crypto. So I think that's a lot of the benefit. I'll be happy to get into the weeds a little more about some of the protocols and some of the stuff, some of which is still new to me because I haven't been keeping up too perfectly, but I've brushed up recently. So that's about my impression of Q and why LexDAO has, or Lex Clinic and LexDAO is so enthusiastic about it.
Okay, thank you. So now let's give the floor to Ramona. You are, as you say, a multi-jurisdictional lawyer, so you've been living and practicing in various jurisdictions around the world, and now you live in Cayman Island. But you have been dealing also about risk management for DAO or governance. So could you please give us a description of this interesting concept of risk management for DAO and governance, and within this main context, give you your opinion about the Q blockchain? Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me and having me be part of this conversation. From what I've heard today, the Q system is very interesting and more resilient for being multi-layered. As Paolo mentioned, I've been operating in various jurisdictions as a lawyer, both civil law and common law countries. I currently live in the Cayman Islands, which gives me sort of a front row seat to a lot of the issues facing DAOs because of the popularity of the Cayman Foundation as a legal wrapper. But I have been trying to expand beyond the legal issues and the legal structures in terms of governance problems, and then how risk informs governance and strategy, and then it will goes from there. So what happened is that I tried to do an inventory of the risks that are confronting DAOs and develop a sort of a taxonomy for it. It was part of the Crypto Valley Association call for papers in terms of risk management generally for the industry, and it got published last year. And then it started a certain number of very interesting conversations because coming from a centralized, governance of big companies perspective and trying to see what's applicable for DAOs, what's new in DAOs, I sort of started to identify a few categories of risks, and which were entirely new for DAOs, and also started to think about, okay, but how can we actually implement something like enterprise risk management in a decentralized fashion in a DAO model where you don't actually have a chief risk manager, or you don't actually have one person who is in charge of things. And I stumbled upon, sort of generated a similar concept of sort of roles and specialized roles that would help provide that service. I call them guardian roles in terms of like, hey, maybe we could train people specifically in the areas of risk management, identifying and then giving them, once they're trained, giving them certain powers. As you mentioned, Martin, the root nodes are actually key to preserving the security of the Q system in terms of having that sort of more trustworthy layer, which is also de-risked from a jurisdictional perspective. So just to summarize a little bit where I what I reached is in terms of outcome, it was more so the number one category was obviously linked to governance risks, like anything from voting apathy, Sybil attacks, centralization or governance imbalance, governance attacks, incentive misalignment, or vote buying. And then the more well-known financial risk and technical risk, which I don't want to go into details because they've been sort of researched more extensively. We're currently at the stage where DAOs have this more siloed approach to risk management. They focus on smart contract risk or liquidity events or management of the DAO treasury, right? In terms of issues. Operational risks, there are an area which is more specific. DAOs have this sort of management gap and strategy gap, and then operational risk are sort of more important compared to traditional organizations because it's harder, right, to do things with groups of people to have that high level of coordination and efficiency. It's quite hard to get at that point. Not even talking about inefficiencies in terms of scaling issues, in terms of like, after we get it right, yes, it can scale, but the very beginning, it's sort of very, very difficult to coordinate. And then in terms of the specifics of legal, regulatory risk, AML risks, anti-money laundering, potential use for crime, like criminal purposes, again, it seems to me like the root nodes in the queue like address those to a certain layer, like at a certain level. So like this is something that can be very beneficial for the DAO participants, because one specific category of risk that is really unique to DAOs is the participant risk. Right? It's like in a traditional organization, we have years and years and years of sort of increasing and developing and expanding upon employee rights and how to protect them and how to make sure that they have, security or protection from liability, and it's the company who is really responsible and so on. But in DAOs, we have the risk of personal liability if there is no legal wrappers, even if the legal wrappers are not standing up to court review, right? Which like many of these new creations haven't been tested at all. And then we can have loss of assets, loss of reputation, which also blocks projects like DAOs from having high quality participants, because to the extent that you have people who have worked for a long time to build up their reputation, they are hesitant to invest a lot of their time and like a lot of their stake, their own reputation in terms of a project who is very early on, right? Very, very immature and just starting. And again, building this sort of reputation with the root nodes and the credibility, and then like it will help. Like from my perspective, what I'm seeing for Q is that it will be very beneficial to reduce participant risk and attract more quality contributors, precisely because of the design. And finally, strategic risk and reputational risk, which all projects are confronted from. And again, this is why it's so important to curate the nodes at the beginning, because again, it reduces reputational risk. It's a more prudent approach, and then it's sort of building a more resilient structure which would stand the test, and then people can actually accrue and come join, and then we'll have more freedom in terms of how you attract more participants. So from a risk management perspective, I can say that I like this structure in terms of the root nodes and how it sort of like layers, and it increases resiliency for the entire project.
So I don't know if there are some questions between the panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in and say, from the conversations I was involved in maybe a couple of years ago in Q's setup, there's a lot of complexity, right? You're setting up game theoretic incentives to make sure that it's not too costly for the user, still worth the root node paying attention. The root nodes have to have a certain amount of maturity, which means that they come with their own requirements and costs. And I'm more impressed by the design structure and how it engages with all of these things at the same time, rather than necessarily solves any of them instantaneously. I think it's a constantly evolving system, as far as I can see. It's as it encounters new use cases, there will be new questions, and that's understood in the design structure. So I'm really enthusiastic about engaging with those questions as they come up. And I think the most impressive part about it to me is really, it is a very specifically structured primitive that can have a lot built on it, and it's going to evolve slowly, and by design, it's going to engage all its participants in that evolution. So I'm hopeful that it just brings a lot of things that traditional law attempts to do, that many in the blockchain ecosystem are trying to replace with chain governance, with network states. Things like having a Secretary of State who has a register of what the organizations are, having a court system that knows how to deal with it, and this is a problem that comes in with a lot of DAOs, that they have a protocol, they bring in a ton of users, they set up a governance, the token price goes down, a bunch of people leave, a new organizational system takes over, and there's this complete void of understanding from current users, new users, what the management structure should be, how centralized it actually is or can be, whether it needs to take drastic measures to re-centralize, to refocus, and having at least a more predictable and understood base layer of what the constitutional governance is, I think could be supremely helpful in long maturity DAOs and in addressing a lot of these completely like what seem to be random DAO disappearances, failures, some of these new kind of like activist investor type attacks where they just buy up a bunch of the token to try and liquidate the treasury because there's no downside for them. They have no concern for what the protocol does. Or in the same way, when a protocol comes out, is very effective, develops a system of governance, and then is at a loss for how it can maintain relevance, how it can maintain attention. And rather than having it just fade off until it's to a point of breaking and then it breaks and restarts, this hopefully offers some structure to how that can move along.
Thank you. Ramona has raised her hand. Yeah, please. Yeah, Ramona, then Martin. Ramona, we cannot hear you. Ramona, we cannot hear you.
Yes, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, I want to build up a little bit on that because I know that Martin is going to respond and potentially link both. I was very curious from a perspective of where the project is. Obviously, Tertius is completely right. It's a process. It's an evolution, and I was curious if you've experimented at all with the risk management in terms of like the traditional methods of risk management. Some of them could work really well in terms of like the SWOT analysis or the Delphi method when we try to generate and like have the people comment and sort of collaborate on certain outcomes or scenario planning. And is that something, because it's something that's a highly participatory, it could be very beneficial in the context of evolving the project. And like, I'm just curious if this is something you've considered or already done. I would be very grateful to hear more about it.
Please. Martin, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where to start. So, on your point, Ramona, on the more traditional risk analysis, we haven't done it in a formalized way yet, but I certainly think this is a very good, very helpful approach, especially now that the project is growing and is growing also in directions that are, partially at least driven by, DAOs or other protocols or other communities, with specific needs that also the core team that has, designed the protocol and mainly built it up until now may not be as familiar with. So I think this is a very good approach, and a lot of generally speaking, we do try to take best practices of other existing areas where skills and knowledge is already there. I mean, it's I think probably preaching to the converted here, but a lot of governance literature and research already exists and has been developed over centuries, if not millennia, before crypto existed. So. And while also, of course, there are new things that we can experiment with, a lot of that is already there, can be used, reused, applied in different ways. So I think that is a good point. Nick, I think what you were saying is very on point in terms of how the protocol develops, that it's a process that also we chose consciously and build it up in a in a structured way. So in terms of where the protocol stands today, we've been running mainnet for over 2 years by now, and pretty much the first year was just the protocol itself without any outside DAOs, quote unquote outside DAOs or protocols are opting into the governance. So that's a fairly recent thing. And that was by design or by choice, because we felt that the system of stakeholders also needs to be built up before it can actually be put to the test and be allowed, so to speak, to govern value that's sitting outside of the protocol. So, including building up the root node set from initially just one, which was the Q International Foundation, which was the, technically the initiator of the project. to now 27. I mean, that's taken some time, but I think it was worth taking that time because we feel now that, you know, there is a solid a panel, and but also in terms of taking over more tasks and the governance features that can be provided becoming slowly but surely more sophisticated. That's definitely a process, and since it's based on human decision making, not only in a technical implementation, there is a timeline and process of scaling that and making that robust. So it doesn't, you can't just ramp it up from one day to the next overnight. Well, you could, but it would be very insecure, and since security is ultimately what we aim to provide with Q, you know, we do try to take these steps one at a time.
Thank you. So Nemo raised his hand, and then we have a question from Simply. So Nemo, please.
Sorry, just wanted to continue Martin's answer in addressing kind of both the questions. So if the majority of the time, or I think about the first year, we were building up the protocol and governing the protocol itself, and then kind of building the robustness of the system. Right after that, we deployed a few dApps of our own and governed that with the system. And then starting last year, August or September, we felt that we can start supporting third-party projects and deploying their, so using the Q governance framework to secure their solutions. And that was a very interesting exercise. So the first thing was that I think it was, from demand perspective, it was wildly successful. We got way more projects either approaching us, or, you know, we've approached them, but it's like starting discussions and wanting to onboard and going through the onboarding process. And we got more projects that we could onboard initially, and we ended up having very quickly a massive backlog. And that's because what Martin was referring to, it was still quite a complex system, and that it has legal elements to it, and we had to kind of support them with great constitutions, making it work. Also, there's the economics of the system that needs to make sense. You can't make something too complex. Also, it's the size of the project. If you give a young project a very complicated governance framework, then you essentially kill that project because they can't pass decisions. So it needs to be somehow very lean, but yet you know, that adds value and can grow with the project. And that was quite a challenge to get, or it mainly took some time to set up with different projects. But we are in the process still of, I think, the last steps of deploying with many of these projects, and I think we did a pretty good job in simplifying the mechanism that projects can start deploying it. One of the things that we realized is that we would probably need to partner up. So we HQ Development AG are very, you know, we're we're supporting to build this ecosystem, but we're not necessarily in the services business, right? And we realized it makes a lot of sense to partner with different partners to deploy this framework, particularly with lawyers. That's actually how Paolo and I kind of started working together, got in touch, and we're starting to build that network of kind of partners that can support us to deploy the Q governance framework with different partners in the future, and kind of continue to grow this. So to Ramona's question regarding the traditional risk management tools, I see that as something that perfectly fits in our next steps, right? As we grow with our partnerships, and as kind of more professionals join in, and essentially can use Q as one of the tool sets, or the Q ecosystem is one of the tool sets they use when they kind of help DAOs or projects in this ecosystem to have a secure governance framework. then I think that's kind of, I think bringing that together with the classic risk management tools fits very well. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're going. And I think that, yeah, there's very good collaboration points here. I can't see the questions, so
Yeah,
maybe
please.
you can. Yeah. I can't see them, or I can't read them for some reason. So maybe someone else can read them out loud.
Simply, can you read, please, your question? Yes.
Sure. So one of the things that's interesting in this ecosystem is related to network effects. And the way that I'm thinking about that isn't from the way that it's typically described, in the sense that like 1 becomes 2 becomes 4, blah, blah, blah. It's more from like a different kind of network effect mechanism, where the network itself is sort of making a determination about where it's going to go to some degree. And at the same time, there's an organic sense of partnerships where organizations begin to orbit each other and have interlink between them, and then other groups of partnerships that are kind of circling around. So the series of questions is related to those 4 topics, and I'll just, excuse me, it's broken out into sort of four parts. The first one I wanted to ask is, what are some of the primary vectors that we're seeing the protocol building against? And what does that look like from a trend perspective? How do you expect those trends to change? And in what ways do you expect them to change? And I'm using the word vector specifically because it's a multi-dimensional sort of component of how things are sort of moving out into the space. So yeah, are there any of you guys who want to kind of kick that piece off, please? I'd be very curious.
Yeah, please, San Martin, Nimo.
So I can jump in. So I think it was a very interesting process for us. I think when we started supporting other projects to kind of use the framework, I think we thought different vectors would be more important for them than what we actually saw as we started deploying. I think, and I think one of the things we really thought that would be a massive driver would be, the whole concept of when you have a governance token that the total market cap is lower than the treasury, and that tax we see kind of on that dynamic, and that would probably be one of the bigger drivers. What we actually saw, at least this is Martin, you feel free to correct me if your view of this is different. As we didn't, I don't think we had these debates before, but one of the things that that really popped up earlier on was actually the participation risk, where a few projects, and I didn't expect that at all, but a few projects came to us straight off the bat, said, look, it was young projects, they were worried that because of the reputation of young projects and many scams in this space, they wouldn't manage to attract relevant people, or even just generate trust in the in their project. Either it was a DAO, or it was gaming, Web3 gaming. It was different things, and that's what they really saw in the Q framework. This, okay, if we have this root node that kind of oversees us and regulates us, that would be a signal to the community that that we are limiting this participation risk for the ecosystem. And that was one big thing that came relatively early. On the trends, what picked up, I think, a lot of traction, and we got a lot of interest, was the whole real world asset topic, which we really quickly saw that. So I think one of the weaknesses in general in blockchain and Web3 is that blockchain can't really communicate with anything that's off chain, right? yeah, with oracles, we can get some digital information from off-chain, on-chain, but even that, there are discussions and what data you can get. But once you even go one step further into real world and regulatory and things that are completely off-chain, blockchain, the whole ecosystem does, kind of breaks. And that was another space that really took interest in Q. So the whole real world assets space, really, we saw a lot of interesting traction. DeSci, which also have a big part that's off-chain, they're one of our earliest adopters. So these are, I think, the main things I've noticed.
Martin, please.
Yeah, I think one thing that we realized when started engaging with project was that really simple, seemingly simple things can add a lot of value that we didn't expect they were. So this may be, even not directly related to the Q core protocol, but we build a DAO framework where you can just, you have a we call it DAO factory. So you can just, set up a DAO, go through, an online, basically, process, takes, 10 minutes if you're quick. If you know what you want at the end of the process, you come out with a DAO. And that includes, if you want that, a constitution, which then can be adapted or expanded to integrate into the Q governance framework. And this was something that initially we didn't even think of, because we thought, there are so many DAO frameworks out there, there is absolutely no need for us to build that. But what we found is that many projects just don't want to bother with getting their own tooling together and picking, choosing, matching different elements, and then using that to integrate into the Q governance framework. But that they're just kind of looking for a one-stop shop because they simply don't want to, they have their core activities, their core business, whatever it is they're doing, and they just want to have things as simple as possible. But that also extends to the experience I think we had with the protocols and integrating into Q, where we were, I think, more thinking of very, coming from a corporate governance perspective, maybe. Thinking of very elaborate frameworks, but in fact, very simple things like creating transparency on treasury proposals, simply stating yes or no is required information, was that submitted, not even assessing the information in any detail, but just providing or testing whether information was provided at all. That seemed to be a benefit for many DAOs already. Even though it's something that's fairly simple, and I think certainly can be expanded, can be extended. But those simple things, just creating transparency, providing an outside perspective of on DAO operations, is something that we got feedback was already an improvement versus the status quo of many DAOs. So I think, vectors that we're building against was, really, we started much simpler than we initially thought we would need to. And now adding complexity slowly. But I think my analogy that I always use is that in terms of governance security today, we're probably at a state still that's similar to kind of smart contract security before the DAO hack. So people don't even have a good understanding for the need for governance security because either they haven't experienced failures, or if they have experienced failures, and this is one of the dangerous parts of governance security, they are so slow. I think, Nick, also what you mentioned, that you just have these DAOs, they start off with a big ambition and they just deteriorate slowly but surely, but actually so slowly that the participants don't even notice it. They just leave at some point and the DAO just disappears. But that is a result of bad governance often. And it does destroy as much value as smart contract insecurities or failures. But it's just not a process that's very visible to anyone who's not inside the DAO and very consciously dealing with a topics DAO.
So we have Tertius now, and then Ramona. Please, Tertius.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I can certainly think of a number of DAOs that I've been participating in that have slow rugged in their own way via governance failure, and it is not as dramatic, and it is not as well documented, and then it's also thus not as, you know, well brought up to the wider community. And I think that's a really good point. And I also just wanted to very narrowly maybe ask, you know, some of my concern with what any DAO or any protocol provider or even any security layer offers is, you know, inevitably you're drawn into providing the things that are needed to you by the people that come to you. How are you maintaining the base root node layer, the base layer 1, layer 2 security, and then providing layer 3 engaging the world, and still allowing other entities and protocols to come in and build a separate DAO factory on Q, you know, a separate voting system. You know, I know that EVM compatibility, and I think that this Lego block building of governance is one of the things I'm most enthusiastic about, but I see that being very challenging coming from separating the two within the fact that you're working primarily on the base layer, but also having to provide enough, you know, top layer support and building so that people can use it easily. But don't let me interrupt Ramona's comment to your previous.
It's actually a follow-up question, and it builds. It's like we like, I swear we haven't coordinated. It's just that this discussion weaves very interestingly. In terms of like a lot of people in the DAO space I've seen, like think of governance in terms of decision-making. It's not. It's decision-making plus implementation. And I just like, if you could comment on that and like what you've seen, I think it builds on Tertius' comment.
Yeah, so, I mean, Ramona, to your point, can you hear me?
Did you finish? Yes. Did you finish, Ramona? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Martin, please, and then we have Nemo.
Yeah, no, to your point, you know, 100%. I mean, this is, and this is maybe the core thesis behind Q, that this implementation or execution of decisions is, you know, in a secure way of governance decisions is what we want to enable, because we've seen from the start that this is exactly the problem. You know, you had protocols a long time ago. I mean, I think we've even quoted in the white paper EOS being one early example where there was a constitution, there was a rule set, decisions were made, but, you know, not executed because there was this gap between the governance layer, which was, you know, written language, and then the blockchain layer, and simply neither a legal nor a technical connection between the two, which then led to failure. And I think we've seen that time and again, and also still see this today quite often, that you have DAO frameworks, constitute DAOs that do make decisions, but then, you know, those are not implemented because there is someone on a multisig who just, you know, does what they want. And there is no concept of how those decisions can be enforced. So I think this is an excellent point, and one that specifically we're trying to address with Q. Nick, to your point, let me just gather my thoughts. So one thing that we're currently working on is enabling also providing Q's governance opt-in features on a cross-chain basis. So to other protocols that are not building natively on the Q blockchain. This is early days. We have the first prototypes currently ongoing, but this is, I think, part of the answer to, you know, how do we scale this, or how do we, you know, provide all the bits and Lego pieces? And I think the short answer is, you know, we can't. So, I mean, as a project, we will not be able to provide everything that other projects need. And of course, you know, there is infrastructure, there's tooling being deployed on Q, but at the same time, we don't want to make the Q base layer blockchain a closed system where you have to build on the blockchain natively to benefit from the governance framework. But the aim is to, yeah, I guess the buzzword here is modular, to make it modular so that it can be used in other ecosystems as well. I mean, there are caveats, obviously. You depend on bridge security, you depend on security of the other layers, whichever they are, layer 2s, layer 1s. But essentially the core of what Q provides with enforceable governance infrastructure that we want to port over to other ecosystems as well.
Okay, so we have Nemo now.
Yeah, I just want to kind of comment about Ramona's comment, which it's kind of funny that you say that, but in the early days when we started kind of talking to other projects about the governance framework and the discussion would very quickly go, or they'd very quickly bring up, oh no, it's fine, we use this forum, this is where we can conduct our conversations, and this is how we do the voting, and it was a bit hard to take them away from that, until we kind of knew to change a bit the positioning with time. But I mean, my personal kind of 2 cents of this is, I think, having corporate governance experts in the world in general, you don't have too many of those, and then the subgroup of those of the corporate governance experts that also are really understand Web3 is a small subgroup, and even and those, and if you are a corporate governance expert, I mean, I don't know many, but I also assume most of them, if you choose that career path, you don't have a fire to be an entrepreneur, right? So that's even a smaller subgroup. And if I think of where we are, so I slightly disagree with Martin's analogy of governance security in comparison to smart contract security. I would see it as we just experienced the DAO hack, but there are not a lot of auditors around, or people still don't really use auditors for their smart, or don't really audit their smart contracts yet. And I think that will take a slightly longer time to see proper adoption compared to auditors, because in the end, smart contract auditors are developers, right? So they were already in the ecosystem when the DAO hack happened. They just got a new revenue stream. And here we need to take people that are not native, or not in abundance in this ecosystem, kind of bring them in, and they need to kind of grow in the industry. So I think that you brought up the point before of training for guardian roles and stuff like that. I see that as a very important step forward that as an industry we need to take. And I think it's just it's going to be a slow process, but I think it's or a slower process than what we saw with auditors. But I think sort of we're on that way, we're on that track.
Okay, so now Nick, please. You need to unmute. Nick, you need to unmute.
I hit the button, but it didn't click. I was going to say, following that, and along what I was thinking of earlier, is the guardians, or some disinterested or partially interested third party, which I think really the root node provides. Not only does it create that kind of security or knowledge that you're not being completely run, it forces a lot of the governance decisions that are traditionally or previously have been made behind closed doors to engage with the system and then publicly produce the relevant auditable material for the community to be engaged in its governance. Because I think there have been plenty of governance systems, there are plenty of tools, that have been used to different effect. But one of my largest frustrations in engaging in crypto governance is that the public face of the governance, the discourse thread with the forum posts and the votes, it never, at first blush, when I was new to crypto, it seemed completely facetious to me that if you don't know who the person is putting up the post and who the people are voting and who the VC is that runs the different delegate, you have no idea what's really going on. You just see this conversation and some people sound really smart, but the actual functional governance is completely opaque. So, I hope that that's a continued focus and utility of Q and the root node in forcing at least a portion of such governance discussion and decision making to be made more public. And they have to convince essentially the node operators that what they're doing is consistent with the Constitution, and in whatever manner each individual entity is structured on Q or using Q governance tooling.
So if there are no other comments, yeah, Nimo, please.
So it's actually funny that you mentioned that, Nick, as well, because that was, I think, the second use case that a project used Q for, which again we completely didn't expect. Was essentially just it was not to highlight the conversations necessarily in the forums or whatever, but different changes that they wanted to make to their code base. Before being able to do so, they on particular topics, they would have to just post that in some open forum. So in that case, it was on their own constitution. They'd need to do an amendment, and if not, if someone would, if you feel that okay, they're hiding something, you could then go to the root nodes and they would check if indeed that is the case, or they were transparent, essentially, as required. So that was actually one of the first, I think the first or the second implementation. And again, we didn't expect that. We came into this, with in our heads was the full kind of potential of Q, and then there's this very tiny part of it that was a huge focus for that project, and yeah, that was an interesting lesson learned. So so it's definitely, I think, the potential that Q brings, and also I think some people really felt that pain, that you felt, right? You go into these forums and something happens and something changed, and you're supposedly a part of it, but you have no idea what happened. And so that was also kind of an interesting part of the journey for us as well.
Other comments?
Sure. The next question, there are a few directions that we could take, because obviously you've addressed so many areas in that dialogue. So I'm going to ask, how are you thinking about, but more so providing observability against outcomes in this new environment?
Anyone? Martin, Nimo?
So observability against outcomes. So I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, so I'm going to try to answer it, but feel free to just point me in the right direction if I'm going somewhere else than you intended. So what we do not do is kind of track success or lack thereof of specific governance decisions ex post. So this is something that we would typically, as I'm using we wrongly probably, but the Q protocol would not be able to provide, which of course nevertheless is an important topic, but not part of what the Q protocol at its core does. What it does provide is, of course, the highest level basically of transparency on how the decisions are made. So all root node decisions and subsequent consequences thereof are fully public. Everything is documented on chain, and also can be traced back to the specific rule upon which those decisions are made. So there is a connection between projects or DAO constitution, hashes stored on chain, constitution is public, and then also within the smart contract framework, of course, there is it's traceable, and the root node decision is documented both on chain, but also with a decision rationale being publicized. So that part is fully fully traceable. But as I said, there is no ex post analysis of effectiveness of the DAO decisions themselves.
So if there are no other questions, I have one question. Yeah, please, simply please,
no, there are two more, but I mean,
no, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, how are you thinking about strategic initiatives against this intersection of governance? And a little bit around what do you see in terms of participation in the governance mechanisms and how those are interacting? So I really mean that from the fact that it sounds as though you would not be determining strategic initiatives per se, but you might be advocating for them. That dynamic is a shift, conceptually speaking.
Yeah, so so maybe in terms of participation first, because I think that is important. So the idea of Q as a protocol is actually that you do not need to rely on governance participation or broad-based governance participation for decisions or rules to be enforceable. So it's kind of a protection against takeover by a minority that's just due to voter apathy or low participation rates in governance. So the idea is that the DAOs or the protocols can set up their own rule sets and enforce those rule sets within certain bounds, of course, that need to be defined, without having to rely on constant large-scale participation of the community in the DAO, because that is something that I think we've seen is it doesn't really work or doesn't really protect against those takeover scenarios that we've seen in some DAOs. So that is one. In terms of strategic initiatives of the protocols that are building on Q or using the governance framework, that is completely up to them. So Q is not opinionated in the sense that it tries to steer other protocols or DAOs in a certain direction. It's really up to them to define their strategic direction, define their own rule sets, and then get support by the Q protocol for enforcing those rule sets. But the strategic direction of those DAOs is really completely up to them.
Simply, do you have more questions?
The last one is, how much of a role are you playing in the onboarding and applied theory for projects? And what are the primary ways that projects begin to sort of orbit each other as partnerships in the space that you're seeing right now? What are the sparks of life that you're starting to see?
Yeah, also take that, but Nimrod, I think also feel free to I mean, this is your area of expertise. I mean, just providing a brief intro. I think right now it's still very much a one-to-one onboarding, where we do workshops with protocol or DAO teams, and then which also helps us, of course, understand what the needs are and where weaknesses or areas of development for Q as a protocol are. But it's still very much one-on-one onboarding process. But very clearly, the goal is to simplify that, to streamline that, to make it easier for other projects to onboard to Q. I'm not sure if there will ever be a fully fully automated kind of plug and play solution. I mean, that is of course a goal. I think we'll always have also bespoke onboarding to a degree, because there are certain themes and certain elements and certain functional areas. I mean, if you look at treasury management, if you look at code upgrades, things like that, that are fairly standard across many protocols, but at the same time, each protocol, each DAO is different and has the specific governance needs. So I think there will always be a mix of more kind of standardized plug and play type solutions or onboarding processes, but also bespoke proposals that are generated by the DAOs themselves. But Nemo, you probably actually might.
Nemo, please.
Yeah. So as Martin said, now it's a lot of work. That was also one of our biggest bottlenecks, to be honest, at the moment, because we work with them one-on-one with these workshops, and then on top of that, adjusting the system. And I agree with Martin's analysis. I think it will never be fully automated. The analogy I see to it is, if you go to the startup world, the Web2 startup world, it's not that complicated to set up your own company, your own incorporation, like your GmbH in Germany, or all over the world, different titles. But yeah, it's not that complicated to set it up, right? If you've done it a couple of times, you probably have already the contracts, you know where you need to go. Third time you can do it probably on your own. Most founders will still consult a lawyer, and definitely for the first time that you do it, you would consult a lawyer. And I think that would be we'll see a similar situation in Q, right? The first times you'll set up your Q governance framework, you'd probably consult, I don't know if it'd be a lawyer or any other kind of service provider that would do it. And we're now, again, kind of experimenting with the different types of service providers that could work. It does make a lot of sense, to be honest, that it would be lawyers with a crypto background and understanding. But we're checking what makes most sense. And that would probably be kind of the standard going forward, I think, in the future. But this is a bit speculative, right? Maybe we'll manage to simplify it really to a 5-click sort of scenario. But I think it comes back to the concept that most tech founders don't have governance backgrounds, right? They're not legal people. They haven't set up companies before, and they don't know how the different structures work. They don't know what makes sense for them, and they would just need that expert to discuss with and support them with that.
So I have,
you had also another question there that I think we. Okay.
I have one question myself. Simply, you finished?
Yeah, that's all the questions from the audience.
Yeah. Okay. So I have one question. Let me say it's a pure lawyer question myself. It's purely agnostic. So we understand Q in terms of which kind of company. And when I say which kind of company, I refer to different jurisdictions. I mean, we know that in the crypto space, there is a big jurisdiction of shopping, I would say, around the world. Ramona lived in one of the most popular, which is Cayman. So from your point of view, does it make any difference, or do you prefer to work, I don't know, with the Cayman company, with the German company, with the Panamanian company, whatever, UK company, Marshall Island company, Duna, or whatever US company?
Short answer is no. I mean, Q as a protocol is agnostic to jurisdiction, and I mean, I'll caveat this with saying that I'm not a lawyer. We do have lawyers in the teams, but the whole constitution is set up in the way that hopefully it works in many, if not most, jurisdictions around the world, and provides also some level of legal security. So, and I'm well, it's maybe more of a personal answer than a Q protocol answer, but I think we tend to overdo legal wrappers a little bit. I mean, you don't need a legal wrapper for everything always, and if you do, maybe not for the whole DAO, but for specific elements, specific functions that then interact with elements of the DAO that are not legally wrapped. And to me, this is kind of the interesting thing, I think, also where the whole space should develop towards to really think more about and develop solutions of what does need a legal wrapper or which element, and have very specific functions that are within legal wrappers, for different reasons, liability, tax, regulatory wrappers that you might need, but then interact with other legal entities, or non-legally wrapped smart contracts that can still be subject to DAO constitutions or private contracts.
Nemo,
we have a whole space there,
yeah,
which
sorry, Martin.
haven't yet fully explored. That's but short answer is there is no bias towards any specific jurisdiction within the Q protocol.
No bias, and no one that works better. So,
Yes.
Yeah, Nemo.
What I would say, maybe we have a small preference towards jurisdictions that recognize the International Chambers of Commerce as an arbitration body. That would be maybe a small caveat to, like, have a small preference, but I know maybe Martin, you have a different opinion on that.
No, yeah, 100% correct. Sorry, I didn't think of that in my answer. So basically, jurisdictions that have ratified the New York Convention and accept private arbitration, essentially. So that is true. But I mean, I think that probably covers most jurisdictions that people would think about typically when setting up a DAO or a legal entity for a DAO.
Mona?
Thank you. So I like what I'm hearing, and I would like to build up on that, and sort of if I would like it even more if you were to confirm, Martin, that a project that has a constellation of legal entities in various jurisdictions can still operate on Q under one legal operating system that ties into the various, plugs into the various legal entities in the various countries.
Yeah, that is a good question. And I'm inclined to say yes, with a caveat that we don't have a live case yet. So if that's something you want to work on, that would be a very interesting case, to have something that is under one DAO constitution, so to speak, but includes various legal entities in different jurisdictions. I think that would be an extremely interesting case. And I think conceptually that would absolutely work. That would require some work, definitely.
I really like that. I might just try. Yeah.
That's the direction, really, where, in my opinion, at least, DAOs are moving. So I don't know if there are other questions. We were past 1 hour, almost 1 hour and a half. I don't know if there are questions, comments. Maybe Marty, you want to give the last 2 minutes, just few final remarks about Q.
Don't really have remarks. Just thank you for having us. I enjoyed the conversation very much, as always, taking away stuff to think about and to do. So, and happy to just keep interacting with LexDAO on all levels, with individual members, as well as, of course, with the DAO itself.
Okay, so thank you very much. And thank you for, this will be recorded, so everyone will be able to see on the YouTube of LexDAO. We have various visitors on our YouTube channel, so that's stay in the space. So thank you everyone for participating, and we can close it here. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.